Hi everyone, thank you so much. First, I'd like to apologize for the sound of my voice. I'm fighting off a rather nasty cold. I don't normally sound like this. I don't smoke a pack a day. This is just where we're at in the semester, so apologies for that. It's, as always, a great pleasure to be here giving the labor market outlook. This is only my, I think, fifth time, so you can do some comparisons with me and Brett at the end. And in a slight change from what I usually do, which is I put policy last, and then I end up running out of time because I love to talk, I'm going to do what I hope is a rather brief outlook on the general labor market, which as always I think is really important for understanding how the agricultural labor market is functioning. Then, given all of the upheaval that we've seen and all of the kind of important changes we're seeing in the labor market policy space for ag labor specifically, I'm going to do that next, and then end with an employment and wage update for Ohio's agricultural labor sector. So hopefully give policy its due, given the important changes that we have seen. So to jump right into what is happening in the general labor market, as we all maybe are aware, the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate. On one hand to keep inflation low, on the other to keep unemployment low. And in this quarter, they are closer to achieving that goal than they maybe have ever been historically. And that is exciting from their perspective, but it also implies something kind of potentially worrying about the way the labor market is functioning. So what we saw in the summer, and this of course got a lot of attention politically because of the revisions that were involved in putting out data. BLS obviously always puts out initial reports for labor numbers, and then those estimates are revised. Those revisions got attention because they were revised downward, and of course we saw the political fallout from that. But the reality is that we saw a dramatic cooling of payroll growth over the summer, and that slowdown in the labor market is one factor that is keeping inflation at bay. And so those two things obviously work opposite to each other. So as payroll growth slows down, inflationary pressures also kind of recede. And so when we look at the payroll and employment growth, that's the purple bars here. You can see that dramatic decline. The initial pre-revision numbers are in the green, and then you can see really why that got so much political attention. The purple bars are far surpassed by the green. And what we also are tracking on this graph is the unemployment rate in the blue line. And what I want to highlight is if payroll growth is so low, what is explaining the fact that in the unemployment rate we are seeing no change. So the unemployment rate has been really flat. Normally with that kind of slowdown in payroll growth, we would expect unemployment to start ticking up. Why has that not happened? There are a few explanations, and really one of them is the fact that lower immigration, so we are seeing a reduction in the supply of labor to this country. This is not just immigration enforcement, removing people, this is just lower immigration overall. Lower immigration is putting negative pressure on the labor supply, so it's a negative labor supply shift or a supply reducing shift. If we look at the graph, the 2025 estimate, this is net immigration to the US. It's down at a really historic low since this data has been tracked, well below replacement for retirees and new entrants into the labor market as well. And so those two things together, so we're seeing demand really stabilize and almost flatline. So demand for new labor is been kept very low. At the same time, supply of labor has shifted leftward, and so we are seeing what we might want to call a labor market imbalance. And what that means is we're seeing a demand slowdown and a leftward supply shift, and we end up at this perfect, almost, I couldn't draw it better myself, perfectly balanced labor market, where the number of job openings per unemployed person, that's the blue line, is almost one. So for every one unemployed person, there is a job opening. And so that is an almost perfectly balanced labor market situation. Usually the general consensus is for a healthy labor market, you want that to be a little bit higher than one. You want there to be active churn in the labor market that's promoting good movement of workers into better jobs. It's promoting promotion, and it's also revitalizing companies and keeping their labor market in motion. So the other perspective on this labor market is that it is not in balance, but instead it is frozen. So it is, when we think of a frozen labor market, another trend that we are seeing right now is there is indeed a hiring slowdown, but there's also a reluctance to lay off workers. So everyone is kind of keeping a very risk-averse outlook on their labor market policy. They're keeping workers on hand that maybe they don't necessarily need or would otherwise be laid off, but just in the anticipation of turmoil later on, they are keeping these workers on their payrolls. And so really we're not seeing new hiring, but we're also seeing new firing. So is it in balance or is it just frozen? And what this really emphasizes is particular difficulty for new entrants to the labor market. So if we look at the unemployment rate, in blue is tracking all workers. Sorry if there are any undergrads in the room or grad students. Bearer of bad news. Really, in general, we always expect the unemployment rate for new grads to be below the unemployment rate overall. New grads are young, they have a ton of skills, they're fresh and exciting, and they know what to do, they have less family pressure. All of that comes into bear on the fact that we expect their labor market participation to be more active than the overall labor market participation rate. But what we are seeing really since 2022, when we started talking about this post-COVID balanced labor market, is their unemployment rate creeping up above the general general unemployment rate. And that is obviously a bad sign for anyone entering the labor market, and it's also a sign that maybe the labor market is not functioning exactly the way we want it to. In a well-functioning labor market, the people who are best equipped to do the jobs are hired to do the jobs, and people are reshuffled out of those positions if they are no longer fulfilling those jobs as well as they could, and we're not maybe seeing that as much as we want. And so really what this foretells is a tricky situation, because if there is to be any thawing in this labor market, so if layoffs start to, and they could, because payroll growth is down, firms are facing a ton of input cost pressure. I'm sure Dr. Sheldon will talk about that later when we talk about incidents of tariffs and who's bearing the cost of that right now. But if layoffs start to begin, unemployment, we are going to see that unemployment rate really increase quite rapidly, and that is obviously not a good sign from our perspective as participants in the labor market, but also from the Fed perspective in terms of their outlooks. And really what we want to highlight as I wrap up this general outlook is this sort of two forces that are kind of in tension right now. So on one hand, we are seeing increases in government debt, and that pressure drives up interest rates. So there's the pressure from increased debt to drive up interest rates. On the other hand, we're seeing downward pressure on interest rates from the demographic situation that the country is facing. So as our population ages and population growth is slowing, so replacement rate, we're still above replacement, but population growth is down. That's due both to lower birth rates, but it's also due to net immigration. So lower net immigration also keeps our population growth down. That is putting downward pressure on interest rates. And so these two things are kind of being held in check right now, and it's really a matter of which will kind of move first and which we will sort of put emphasis on. And really that's one factor that's at play. And then the other thing that firms have to sort of be asking themselves is how they're going to protect their margins. In light of these increasing input costs that they are facing, there's really two options. From a general economics perspective, we know two ways you can increase revenue. One, you can increase prices. That's not a good sign for increased inflation. That increased prices will also obviously contribute to increased inflationary pressure. So we're not looking forward to that necessarily. But from a labor market perspective, the other way to protect margins is to decrease costs. And right now, the kind of elephant in the room is that the obvious way to decrease costs is to reduce headcount and lay people off. And so if firms decide that they're going to start protecting margins through force reductions or unemployment increases, that's when we're going to see an increase in unemployment, and that's when this labor market thawing is really going to happen, and of course not have positive outcomes for the functioning of our country's labor market there. So that's the doom and gloom sort of outlook on in terms of how the labor market is functioning. And in terms of those two countervailing forces, the kind of note I'll leave with is that both of these things are happening at the same time, and it's really kind of a question of which policymakers are going to emphasize when they make decisions. So they can pick one or the other, really can't address both at the same time with the tools that we have in our toolbox right now, but really it's a question of which is going to get more emphasis from policymakers, and that is of course a different sort of question and political economy style that I'm sure Dr. Sheldon will also address at least a little bit. Turning now to agricultural labor policy, of course, the big headlines, the thing that's getting the most attention is increased immigration enforcement and immigration action. And the question I get asked the most, obviously in my role as an agricultural labor economist, is have we seen any on-farm impacts? And the answer to this question is made quite complicated by the fact that we don't really collect very good data. There's not really one source you can go to look at how this is being impacted. So everything is kind of right now very nebulous, and we're still sort of trying to sort out what's the best way to track this, what's the best way to understand the impacts that this is having. One thing that kind of has gone under the radar slightly, although very grateful to our friends at Farm Doc, they did a nice story on this, but the administration's Department of Labor representatives made a filing with the Federal Register in mid-October warning of threats to the stability of domestic food production if the current rate of immigration enforcement were to continue. And so that is not necessarily just what is happening in terms of farm workplace raids, which we don't know the extent to which those are happening, but it's also whenever raids happen in other workplaces, you see churn in the labor market, so you see people move potentially from on-farm employment positions to fill spots that were vacated by people working in cities. That churn does happen, and we also see what we call chilling effects. So just the rumors of these things happening is keeping people away from work, and that's just a reality of the way people's minds work. Even if they have papers, even if they are have legal work authorization, we are going to see chilling effects then, because the way in which this is happening has been a little bit more indiscriminate, and it's sort of having that sort of deleterious effect on people's willingness to show up to work. And so the direct quote is pretty dire, and this is from DOL administrators themselves, and it's requesting immediate action to address the fact that the country really does not currently have a stable source of lawful labor, and stable is one thing and also timely is the other. So the response has so far just been, just use H-2A. Anyone in the room who has any familiarity with the H-2A program knows H-2A is not timely. It has at least a 3-month lag time if you're looking to get workers in. So there's really no recourse for that. And if you're a dairy in the audience, work in a dairy or own a dairy in the audience, or any sort of animal agricultural operation, I really feel for you, because there's really no way in which you can effectively use the H-2A program. And so they're really the ones being lost in the lurch, and the response, just use H2A, is starting to feel a little flippant, if that's my professional opinion, because it is really not an effective solution to the problem. And it may be stable and it may be lawful, but the timely thing is the thing that I think is most crucial at this point. So as I said, there's really no single cohesive data source. You can, you put it into Google and you can see all sorts of anecdotal stories. There's plenty of examples. They're happening at every range, every size of operation. They're happening around the country. It's not, being isolated in one kind of state or another. It's not being targeted at one kind of agricultural operation. So it's really right now, it feels what we would think of as quite random or quite, ad hoc. So until we see, official language on how this is actually being carried out, it's difficult to know if there's any sort of targeted strategy or if it's just up to the individuals involved where they're going to go and who they're going to talk to. So that's been pretty damaging. And then also, of course, getting a lot of attention is farther down the supply chain, or the value chain, I should say, is the effects on meat packers and food processors. That those are especially hard hit in these types of situations because they are quite reliant on immigrant labor and often immigrant labor that lacks work authorization. I did mention the chilling effects, and those are really, so if you read interviews with, I think it was the director of California Farm Bureau, they said the rumors are just as damaging as the reads themselves at this point. And that is something that we've seen in the labor market before. It's not new to this current situation, and it's not really nothing to do so much with what's happening specifically right now, but it is something that is a feature of any kind of immigration enforcement, is that those types of things have a negative impact, even if they are not directly applicable to you as an individual worker. It is going to cause absenteeism and unwillingness to show up to work. And so that is a little bit more doom and gloom. And contributing to the uncertainty for a farm producer or a manager of labor is the kind of going back and forth on whether or not ag is exempt. Obviously, ag is a crucial part of this country's economy. It's been the mainstay of our economy since the country was founded, really, and the question of whether or not ag is exempt, so this idea of ag exceptionalism in labor policy has been something that has rang true for a really long time, and we're starting now to question whether or not that is going to remain true going forward, because there were reports that, okay, farms are going to be exempt, we're not going to do raids on agricultural workplaces or on food processors, and then a week later that was reversed, and it's hard to follow exactly. So from a producer perspective, the thing that people want the most is clarity. So uncertainty in the labor market is always counterproductive. You want to be able to know, what do I have to do to protect myself, to protect my workers, what are my rights, what are my workers' rights? All of those things are important to know, and it requires some sort of forethought, and it requires knowing whether or not these things are a valid concern. And of course, I mentioned already how untimely the replacement workers through H2A are. And then it's really unclear if the source of this back and forth is disagreement. Obviously, we know in the administration there are obviously strong pro-business, and I'm putting pro-farm almost in quotes or in parentheses with a question mark, because it's really hard now to tell if the farm sector is something that is going to be given its special place and given its more so than any other industry, reliance on these kinds of workers. Unclear whether or not they're going to get the targeted policies that are actually going to work for the industry. It's unclear, but regardless, the pro-business faction, and then there's a strong anti-immigrant of any kind, legal or otherwise, and it's unclear if that's what's causing the tension. It's hard to say. And there's been talk of special visa status or some sort of worker or employer-sponsored type program for workers who have been identified as being, valid or helpful contributors to their workplace or their operation. And all of it so far has been talk, and as we kind of know, the value of talk until it's actually put into policy and there's actually a plan to implement it and there's actually a cessation of these kinds of actions, it's really, the value of it is not very high right now, and so there is that. Last year, I'm looking at my predictions. I said the thing that's going to affect the magnitude of the shock is going to be targeting. And right now, it seems like targeting is not. It's not specifically targeting ag, but it is still. I was hopeful that there would be more of this exceptionalism type stance, and that really has not come to bear. I'll talk really quickly now about the notable changes to the H-2A program, which are really the one bright spot in terms of the outlook for agricultural labor policy. Again, I'm going to pat myself on the back. What I said was most likely, well, I said more likely, but I'll pretend I said most likely, even though it's up there on the slide for you all to see, was a freeze in the AWR. So the wage rate paid to H-2A workers, I felt like this was the most likely outcome in terms of how the H-2A program is going to function. And I'm happy to say that that's right, hooray for me, and hooray for all of you who employ H-2A workers, because the methodology has changed, but really what the outcome of this methodology change will be is a lower AWR across the board, every state. The range of reductions in the hourly wage is somewhere between $3.50 to about $1.25. Which state is going to get which reduction, that's still in process, but they're working that out. And so really what's the source of this reduction is they're using a different data source. They're moving away from the FLS and using a different data source instead. And they're only using, and this is going to be the key, in the past, if workers, for example, were driving heavy machinery, the wage rate that was used to calculate the wage, or that went into the formula to calculate wage, was the wage rate for a heavy machinery operator, which, as you can imagine, is quite significantly higher than the wage rate of a crop worker or farm worker. And so now they're using more common occupation codes only. There's only going to be 2 skill-based categories per occupation, and those are going to be determined by the operator's job description. And also, this is also quite a big win. The AWR is also going to reflect the free housing provision from the H-2A program. So if you bring in H-2A workers, they're required to be provided housing at no cost. That is going to be factored into their compensation package and reduce their hourly wage further. So I'm going to skip my swan song for agricultural labor data, but I'll leave with this food for thought. We saw 2 really important sources of agricultural labor be lost. I have no qualms with using a different source to calculate the AWR, but losing farm-specific surveys that talk about the problems agricultural workers have, agricultural employers have with accessing workers and the difficulties in the labor market, it's I think really quite damaging. Obviously, I'm not just saying that because I use the data all the time, but it is something that we really need these. How can we talk about the problems if we don't have the data that describe them? And I'll just end with projections for Ohio's H-2A use. If we continue on our current rate of growth over the past 10 years, we're going to see, for the first time, north of 5,000 H-2A workers in the state. We're seeing a little bit of a softening on wages, particularly for our high-skill farm equipment operators, and that you can see is ticking down after a year of really unprecedented wage growth. That's that red line there at the top. And then last, if Ohio gets the average decline in AWR, so for the H-2A program, we're going to see a AWR in Ohio of roughly $2 less than where we are now. So right now we're at $19.18 per hour. We're going to see about $17.25 an hour. So that's a significant reduction in our wage for our H-2A workers in the state. So that is at least one. I finally get to do some good news in this, but I'll just leave those with you. And if there are any questions, I'm sure I've blown through my time, but